Hi, I'm Judy Farvolden. I'm the Managing Director of Mobility Network, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third session of the Way Forward in 2023. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years. It has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This event is being recorded and will be shared. Oops. The Mobility Network at the School of Cities is an institutional strategic initiative at the University of Toronto. 2 years ago, U of T recognized that the sustainable movement of people and goods is a global challenge that can only be addressed by cross-disciplinary collaboration among university researchers and further through collaboration with the public and partners in government and industry. Mobility Network, a group of about 70 researchers from across U of T's 3 campuses, whose diverse interests span the broad scope of critical issues about mobility, is the University of Toronto's answer to that global challenge. We've organized that broad expertise into 7 knowledge clusters. Of course, everything is connected to everything, but this organizing principle shows our focus on key challenge areas like equity and inclusion, land use economy, climate change and health, emerging new mobility technologies and services, and let's not forget freight and urban goods movement. We wrap that up in the green circle to remind ourselves that transportation, mobility, accessibility is all about people. It's about who they are and the needs and wants they have, and those needs and wants generate their demand for travel. And that is wrapped up in an outer circle that reminds us solutions must work within the constraints of our natural environment, our built environment, and our government's environment. So welcome to the third of 6 planned sessions that will run every other week until mid-June. This session is on considering access, ethics, and practice of data and mobility policies. And with that, I will press it off to Professor Bree McEwen, our moderator. Over to Bree.
Thank you, Judy, and to everyone. I'm Bree McEwen. I'm an associate professor in the Institute for Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And I'm also the associate director for UTM of the Data Sciences Institute. And so our UTM thematic programming this year for DSI, another ISI, is on responsible data science. So I'm quite pleased to be the moderator of today's panel considering access, ethics, and practice of data in mobility policies. Data plays a significant role in mobility policies and planning, especially in forecasting, policy evaluations, and assessment. Planners, administrators, and academics acknowledge the importance of accurate data for efficient mobility policies. The surge in the collection and use of data over the last decade raises questions over its access, ethics, and practice. Our 3 panelists are here to bring their perspectives to a discussion about how we should be working toward effective and ethical data collection and access. They're each going to take a few moments to bring their perspectives to this discussion, and then I will moderate a question and answer discussion, or I'll moderate a panel discussion, and then we'll take some questions. The chat has been configured so that you can message me your questions directly, and you can please post your questions in the chat. I'll introduce each of the panelists in turn, beginning with Gaurav. Gaurav Mittal is a UTM Mobility Network postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Management and Innovation here at UTM. His academic interests include urban governance, public transport, political economy, and Southern theory. His current research focuses on regulation of micromobility interventions and political economy of low carbon transitions in informal transport. Today, Gaurav is going to talk about issues with data sharing agreements in public-private service partnerships, the use of data by private companies, and the lack of agency of Indian city governments regarding data ownership.
Thanks, Bree. Thanks for having me at this panel. I'm grateful. As Bree said, I'm going to talk about my research experience from India, where most of my research is located. More specifically, I'm going to talk about data ownership and privacy issues. And it brings out the questions such as who collects the data, who owns it, who uses it, and for what purpose. And moreover, what are the safeguards to avoid the misuse of this data? India is a country where data laws are generally very weak, or I should say non-existent. The Constitution of India establishes the right to privacy as a fundamental right, but there are no special legislation which cover data protection. Right now, as I speak, there's a digital personal data protection bill, which is pending in the parliament, going through the scrutiny. But people who have read the draft of this bill, they in fact are calling it a data surveillance bill instead of data protection bill. So through this bill, what the state is trying to do is that the state is trying to come in control of data instead of giving privacy to the citizens. In this light, data issues in mobility policies become even more important. And it is also important because for a long time in India, for any transport researcher who works on India, that they would know that data has been non-existent. The government does not care about data much, and neither it produces anything. Uh, it it shows that even you cannot have the estimate of the number of vehicles which are on road in India, because the government only has data of how many permits the government has issued, but they don't know how many vehicles have gone off-road. So the data situation is so bad in India generally. And then why are we talking about it, right? We are talking about it because this practice, the data practices in mobility policies, changed sometime in last decade with the entry of private players in mobility provisions. One of the foremost of them is Uber. That happened everywhere in the world. Uber came and it actually found lacuna in transport regulations, and it started operating in that lacuna. Slowly, governments caught up with that, and they brought in new regulations to regulate the operation of Uber, but also regulations to protect data which Uber collects. But this is something which did not happen in India at all. Uber still collects the data as it wants to collect, and nobody knows where the data goes, what kind of analysis happens, and what is the outcome. They keep on shaping their services through the use of this data. If you go to the website of Uber and the other big company which operates in India is Ola, if you go to website of both of these companies, you will see that they have some guidelines for data. They call it data policy. I will not call it data policy because they are just some guidelines. And in those guidelines, they say that they are based on international standards. But at the same time, you can see that they are very opaque. In fact, they say that they are free to share this data with any third-party service provider, and we don't know that which third-party service provider who is getting the data. But we definitely know that the government does not get any data. Neither is government interested in any data. Now, Uber, Ola, ride-sharing companies, they are private players who entered the mobility market. But what happens when publicly provided service enters in partnership with a private company? What happens to the data then? So that is what I'm going to talk about slightly in detail today. This is the case of Mumbai. Mumbai is the second biggest city in India. It is perhaps the only city in India where public bus services are provided by a government undertaking, which is under municipality. In other cities, also other major cities, at least the public bus services are provided by government undertakings, but those are generally regional government. It's only in Mumbai that the undertaking, which is known as BEST, Bombay Electric Supply and Transport Undertaking, Bombay later changed to with Mumbai, and it comes under the municipal corporation. BEST entered into a partnership with a private mobility firm called Cello. Cello is a bus that happened in 2021. Cello is a bus transport technology company that provides live bus tracking services and contactless payment solutions. In partnership with BEST, they first launched a mobile app to track all the buses which are operated by bus, and then later came up with a co-branded tap-to-pay digital smart card to facilitate transport services. So this digital smart card is something like an Oyster card, which we use here in Toronto. It works on a closed loop basis. Although in Toronto now we are changing the machines and we are going to move to open loop system, through which we don't need Oyster card as such, but we will be able to use any credit or debit card for our transport needs here. In India, it is still closed loop card, which is serviced by Cello. With this partnership, Cello has been collecting data from public for almost 1.5 years now. And this data still, the ownership of data is not very clear, that who owns the data. As I understand, BEST is not interested in this data, but BEST is just interested in the services which Cello is providing. But recently we can see that Cello has in fact launched an on-demand public bus service in the city. At first, I thought that the public bus service would also be in partnership with the BEST, but as it turns out, no, the bus service is not in partnership with the BEST, but Cello's own venture. So it makes it very clear. We don't know what happens inside and all, but it makes it very clear that Cello has been using the data which it has been collecting as part of the bus tracking service and contactless payment system. And through that, they came up with the routes which might be most attractive for people for an on-demand bus service. And then they launched that service. Still, I'm saying that it is not very clear, but that is my understanding that that it has happened in that way, and that's why BEST is not in partnership with this venture. The other thing which I want to highlight here is that the role of local governments in data ownership in India. Again, the local governments are very weak. They have no tax collection sources of their own. They rely on central government for almost everything. And that also reflects in recent data missions which are coming up from the central government. So the government of India has launched something called India Urban Data Exchange in 2021. And then in 2022, they have launched Digital Urban, National Urban Digital Mission. So through this, they are establishing integrated command and control centers across the country, but mostly in the regional centers and at a central location, where they are going to be these big data centers, which are going to store a lot of data. And the vision is that this data can be used by researchers or any other person who wants to come up with any kind of solutions for urban problems in India. However, when we try to access the data, we can see that the quality of data which is collected is not great, because again, the data is being collected by the local governments, the city governments, and then it is being stored by the central government. In this, what happens that the local governments do not have any interest in the data collection. They just do it for the formality's sake. They collect the data and then they put it in the system. And that data is almost of no use for any researcher or anyone who wants to come up with any solution for that. I highlight this because it shows that how the local governments in India lack agency when it comes to data collection and data ownership. If they don't have data ownership, if they don't have stake in decision making, they are not going to collect the relevant data. And then the quality of data is going to be really bad, which is bad for the central government, bad for the researchers, bad for anyone else who wants access to that data. So that becomes a big issue in India. Now to just think, sitting in Toronto and why am I talking about a case in India? It's about, I think that there is a lot of room for the governments, especially in global north and global south, to learn from each other. And it's not that the case in Toronto is very clear and the data policies in Toronto are very great. But at the same time, there are some practices in place which could be replicated or used or adapted in case of India. So there is a room for exchange, government to government exchange in these kind of issues. We see that this happens a lot by private players, especially companies like Uber and all. They are really good at adaptations to local circumstances in different locations and all. And that also, I mean, we are talking about mobility data policies, but there's also mobilities in policies which can be replicated again from global north to global south and all. So in that way, I want to highlight this, that it might be useful as the private players, the private companies learn from each other context and then try to adapt to the places. The governments could also adapt. Thank you very much, Pri. I'm done.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Al, who has his camera on and is here. Alberto Leon-Garcia is a professor in electrical and computer engineering. He's been recognized as an innovator in computer networking research and education. His research is focused on application platforms, including smart infrastructure. In smart transportation, his team is developing a data management platform for gathering, distributing, storing, and mining information about the state of the transportation system that can be used by public and private application providers to deliver intelligent transportation and transit services. Today, Al will talk about his experience with data sharing agreements with several cities and data that is made available on open portals.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I was expecting to be in the audience.
Yeah, thank you for that too, Al.
But anyway, access to data is an interesting topic, and for myself as a researcher at the university, it's always an adventure to get the next piece of data. So I thought what I would do is I would relate some of my experiences over the last few years, and in terms of obtaining access to data from various cities. I think the voyage, if you will, in terms of gathering data and trying to leverage it for uses in transportation, and more recently, in my case, emergency response, started for myself with the city of Vaughan. And there, what I had was I had a substantial grant for sensor data, computing data, wireless data, and I was interested in trying out some of our architectures by deploying a prototype of the system in the city of Vaughan. And of course, the goal was to gather data, process it, do learning on it, and be able to apply it in both open loop in the sense of dashboards, driving dashboards, and closed loop eventually in the sense of controlling various processes such as traffic. In the case of Vaughan, we had a very receptive group in the IT department in Vaughan, all the way to the CIO. And so that made the initial progress in terms of getting the interest in the project and getting it going, establishing a partnership, that made it easy. But once we went to the formal process of establishing an agreement, the key issue became data. And in this particular case, it was a little bit different than most. It wasn't data that they were collecting. It was data that we were going to collect. And so, of course, there were issues in terms of what data would be collected, who would own it, maintaining privacy, and so forth. So net, after having already been working together for about a year, it took 18 months before we had an agreement. And COVID came shortly after that and completely derailed those efforts, right? All of the students that I had by the time COVID, I won't say it's over, but had reduced, all of those students were graduated, and that project was kind of stuck. In the meantime, I've had other efforts in terms of collaborations, and the next two were in the context of getting video data. I was interested in doing near miss detection with a goal towards having methods that could be used in attaining vision zero. And the first experience was with the city of Guelph, and then the next one with the city of Surrey. And the approach here wasn't at a high level, like the CIO level. It was practitioners who were dealing with the collection of the data and its use in transportation. And the reception in both cases was very welcome. We were very welcome. But again, once we got to the data, what happens is the practitioners don't have the say in terms of how the data is used. In this case, we're talking about data that was being collected by the city through cameras for their own internal usage. And we were seeking to get access to this data. And in one case, in the case of Guelph, we were able to get permission to access the data, but their practice with video, and I think most cities do that, is the video is only retained. Their systems anonymize it from the beginning. So that wasn't as much of an issue, but nevertheless, data is not kept more than 24 hours. So in the case of Guelph, the condition was that we had to do all our processing within 24 hours. Okay. In the case of Surrey, once our contact went higher ups to try to get permission, he came back and said, you know what? We have some data that's open. Why don't you use that? Okay, and we made some use of that, but it wasn't as useful as we needed. The next experience is with the city of Edmonton. There we had a project that we call Safe City Project, and it was basically working with the Edmonton Fire and Emergency Response Organization. And they collect their own data with regards to EFRS events. They classify by type. They have the when it occurred, approximately where it occurred, the equipment involved sometimes, and the event duration. And we were trying to, again, work our way through an agreement so that we could have access to a somewhat richer set of data. But again, after several months of trying, we sort of decided, okay, we're just going to go with the data that's on their open portal. It turned out that that was sufficiently rich and that we could do some useful things with it. And we're now in the process, now that we can been able to take their data, demonstrate to them that there's some useful insights that we could give them with regards to their planning of their operations, both short term and long term, like within 1 week and in the scale of years. Okay. Now we're working on an additional agreement where they'll provide us with finer grain data, because the insights we'll be able to provide will be quite a bit richer. In the case of one of the factors in terms of emergency response is travel time. Okay, and here we tried to connect with the transportation department in Edmonton, and it turns out that the transportation data doesn't belong to the city of Edmonton; it belongs to the province. So there are two layers of permissions here. We're trying to do modeling of response time so that we could model both the occurrence of the emergency events and the response time, and have a view of the state of the traffic. And we gave up on that one. Instead, we're currently doing travel time modeling from a feed that's provided by York Region. York Region has an extensive system of Bluetooth monitors at something like 437, I think, intersections. And what they do is they capture the MAC address of cars as they pass, Bluetooth MAC addresses. They anonymize, they hash them right away. And then they look for these vehicles down the road at the next Bluetooth. And based on Bluetooth sensor intersection, and based on that, they're able to provide something like 1,400 speed estimates by looking at the elapsed time between the sensors. And they produce this every 5 minutes. And basically, I've had my students collecting this data because they only retain it not for very long. So we've been collecting this data. We have several months worth of this data, and we're currently working on various types of modeling to predict the data and to identify anomalies and various type of phenomena in the York transportation region. Let's see. So the takeaways that I have here is those instances in which we've been able to move forward successfully have been those instances in which the city had chosen, for whatever reasons, to make certain data open, and where the data was sufficiently plentiful and granular that we could use it in our studies. So the first takeaway is work with cities that have made their data open, okay? And not all cities do that. If you look City of Toronto, it's relatively limited what's available. And to us, the York Region travel time has been a boon, okay? In addition, they have cameras in intersections and they display images. And so you have two streams of data that you can use in a multi-stream modeling approach to try to do prediction. So that's the first thing. The second takeaway is once you start working with these cities and you have partners and stakeholders, your first task is to demonstrate value in what you're doing, value to them. And the second task is to then work with them to get more granular data, if you will. So that's what I have to say with regards to my experience gathering data and working with cities.
Thanks,
So I'll be
Bill.
glad to take questions. Yeah.
We have one more speaker, and then we will get to those,
Okay, great.
questions.
Yeah.
Our next speaker is Jue Wang. I'm going to turn it. Hi. Jue Wang is an assistant professor in geography, geomatics, and environment at UTM. Jue's research interests include human mobility, health geography, and environmental health, GS science, big data, and spatial analysis. His recent research has included exploration of methodological issues in environmental health studies and the development of a unified analytical framework for individual exposure assessment. Today, Jue is going to talk about potential privacy concerns with individual tracking mobility data like GPS and mobile phone tracking and perhaps those Bluetooth things that Al was talking about, and the obstacles of sharing these data sets, and then pose potential solutions like geomapping techniques.
All right, thank you, Bree, for the introduction. Let me share my screen for some slides I prepared for this event. Can you see the slides, Bree?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Oh, okay, cool, perfect. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today I will talk about the geo-privacy issue of mobility data. As technology has advanced, so as our ability to track people's movement using GPS and mobile phone trackings and also like the Bluetooth tracking. Well, this has obvious benefits such as analyzing human movements patterns and improving urban plannings, etc. But it also raises a number of privacy concerns. So in this talk, I will cover three main points. First, I will discuss the potential privacy concerns that arise when individual tracking mobility data is collected. Second, I will highlight some of the obstacles that prevent the sharing of these data sets. And then lastly, I will explore some potential solutions, such as geo-masking techniques. Let's start by discussing the privacy concerns associated with individual tracking mobility data. So when we talk about mobility data, we're typically referring to data that's generated by GPS, mobile phone tracking, and well, as I said, this data can be incredibly useful for a variety of purposes, such as traffic analysis, human mobility study, urban planning, and even like health studies by analyzing people's like daily mobility and behavior patterns. It can also be used to invade privacy. So first, this data can be highly sensitive, as it can reveal a person's movements and patterns of behavior over time. For example, if an individual's location data is accessed without their consent or knowledge, it could potentially be used to track their movements, monitor their behavior, or even targeted them for unwanted, let's say, advertisements or other form of manipulation. On another level, one obvious issue is the potential for the data to be like hacked. For example, if one person gains access to this data, they can track a person's movement and maybe potentially use the information to stalk them or commit other crimes. This is very dangerous. Another concern is the potential for this data to be used to discriminate against certain groups. For example, a landlord may use this data to determine whether or not to rent an apartment to someone just based on their movement patterns. Or service providers could use the data that lead to discrimination against the people who just live in certain neighborhoods or who have certain lifestyles. The second point I would like to discuss is the obstacles to accessing or sharing data. Specifically, I want to focus on the academic obstacles. Academic researchers may face a number of obstacles when trying to assess or share mobility data. The first concern is ethical and legal considerations, right? There may be ethical and legal consideration related to the use of mobility data, such as we need to follow the consent from the data contributors, or ensuring the protection of privacy rights and avoiding potential harm to the individual or groups who contribute in the data. Secondly, private companies or government agencies or other scholars who collected the data may restrict access to mobility data due to like different concerns from themselves and making it difficult for academic researchers to obtain or use the data. And the private company or government may also claim ownership or intellectual property rights over mobility data, and making it more difficult for academic researchers to use the data without permission. And lastly, academic researchers may face the financial or resource constraints to purchase mobility data if they come from private sectors, or they need to collect their own data due to a lack of data sharing. And these obstacles can have significant implications for scientific research. Let's say without access to mobility data, researchers may be unable to reproduce or validate previous findings, limiting the overall productivity and impact the research in the area. Additionally, the limit sharing of mobility data can be a potential waste of resources, as the researchers may spend significant time and money attempting to obtain data or repeat the same data collection. Just as in the past summer, our team were collecting individual tracking data, and because we won't be able to get the similar kind of data with high quality easily from other sources. And addressing these obstacles is crucial for advancing research in the field and ensuring that mobility data can be used in a way that benefits the society and also protect individual privacy rights. Now now we have already discussed the potential privacy concerns and the obstacles to sharing the data. Now let's turn to potential solutions. One promising approach is to use geomasking techniques. Geomasking involves obscuring certain parts of the dataset in order to protect individual privacy. For example, one could use a technique called k-anonymity to ensure that each individual in the dataset is indistinguishable from at least k-1 other individuals. And another potential solution is to use the differential privacy techniques. The differential privacy involves adding noise to a dataset in order to obscure certain details while still allowing overall trends and patterns to be discerned. This technique has been successfully used in a number of different applications. For example, the Google's wrapper system, which collects data on users' web browsing habits while still preserving their privacy. So if the mobility data is being applied with this either geomasking or differential privacy techniques, it can reach a certain level of privacy. So depending on the nature of the data itself, the data owners could potentially share the data. While this solution so promise, it's important to recognize that they're still in the early stage of development and requires further research and refinements. So continued efforts to develop and implement these solutions, as well as explore new approaches, especially the approaches suitable or tailored for the mobility data, will be critical to addressing the privacy issue of mobility data and enable data sharing in the area. Additionally, policy and governance frameworks can also play a crucial role in addressing the geoprivacy and the sharing issue of mobility data. So this could including, let's say, developing clear guidelines and regulations on the collection and the use of mobility data. And also the public education awareness campaigns can also help to raise awareness about the potential risk and the benefits of mobility data and fostering a culture of responsible data use. So in conclusion, the geoprivacy issue of mobility data is a complex problem that requires careful consideration. While there are certain potential benefits of collecting and sharing this data, we must also aware the potential privacy concerns and the obstacles to share your data. Fortunately, there are a number of potential solutions, including the geomasking, differential privacy techniques, and also governance frameworks we can develop on. By working together and developing these solutions, we can help ensure that the mobility data is used in a way that benefits the society as a whole, while still protecting individuals' privacy. That's my talk. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Bree.
Thank you. So we have about 20 minutes or so for questions. I have a set for our panelists, but please feel free to put questions that you have in the chat and I will work those into our discussion as we go. So kind of thinking through all three of your topics and the way that you've been working on data and collecting things for these types of projects. You know, in part, I'm also thinking about some of the things that Al was saying about how difficult it can be to get this data, and also recognizing that we have a postdoc and an assistant professor here who need these data to be able to complete projects, right, and move forward in your career. And so I'm wondering, on the data collection side from various agencies, provinces, cities, states, what are the incentives for them to collect this kind of data? Are there any incentives for cities to collect this data?
Yeah, I think there are incentives. If whatever organization, be it transportation, emergency response, or something else, there's some performance indicators that measure the success of the organization in achieving their objectives, and data is essential to evaluate those KPIs. So for internal purposes, there's strong reasons for these organizations to collect data. Okay, now that's for their own internal use. And that's a no-brainer if so long as they respect whatever policies are in place for the city and or organization. The issue or the question becomes one of under what circumstances should this data be either made public or be made available for research. And that's where the question is. And whereas I would say when the movement towards open data began, there was this idealistic sense of opening up the data. I think what I see now is more one of when is it beneficial to the organization or the city to share this data. Okay, and it makes a decision of whether to share data or not difficult for a city absent proven cases of useful uses of these, right? So you get into this conundrum in terms of how do you go about deciding when to make it open or not. And from my view as a researcher is just be opportunistic. If the data is there, go in, use it, reward the organization by giving them useful results and so forth. And hopefully that way encourage them to make more data open. So that's my take.
Gaurav, I was wondering about your take on this because you just sort of caught my ear when you were talking about, you know, different Indian municipalities where the local agencies have to collect the data, and it was like, fine, we did the thing, right? And then solutions, and I drew this little thing of like collection of data, solutions, but this like middle piece of what's happening there. So I'm wondering, you know, what kind of incentives could be provided to them to think about the way that they're collecting and cleaning data as it goes?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bree. So the thing is, I think the case of India is slightly similar to what Alberto was talking about, that how a lot of things are actually call for some other city I could not get, but how transport is controlled by the regional government. So they may not have even the agency to do anything. I painted the case of Mumbai. Mumbai is an exception in India, where transport is actually controlled by the local government, the city government. In each and every city other than Mumbai, the transport is controlled by regional government. When they have no control over the transport, they have no incentive to collect the data or to think about transport solutions. So that is one thing that I think going forward, we have to demand that how transport is a local government's issue and should be under the local government. The other thing is that we need to empower the local governments to make decisions. I mean, again, financially, they are not very strong. So if they are not very strong financially, they are not able to bring in any solutions. Like in last 2 decades, if we see in India, most of the transport related programs are sponsored by the central government from the Indian government instead of local government. So it was around, I think, 2008 that the government bought almost 25,000 buses and gave to various municipalities to operate. But municipalities did not have any data to think that where should they operate those buses, how should they go about it. Within 5 to 10 years, all the buses went out of service and there was no replacement. So in the sense that it was a waste of money. So my point would be that local governments need more stake in decision making. Once they have more stake in decision making, they will start collecting relevant data. And that data can be used by the researchers also.
We have a question from the chat, and so I'm going to adjust it slightly, but the question is there, this is a Canada-based question, is there an institution that regulates mobility data usage in Ontario or Canada? Is there sort of a common resource, or if we think about human subjects research, right? We all think about going to the REB and that particular ethics law. Are there ethics laws in place regarding mobility data in Canada or Ontario or Toronto?
Jue, please, yes.
Go ahead, Jue.
Okay. So I'm sorry.
Yes.
Maybe you can say something first, and then you can follow.
No. I was just going to say that I have come to Canada very recently, about 4 or 5 months. So I mean, my information may not be very correct on that. So Jue, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
No problem. I just know something about this part. But so first, I want to bring up is that actually there is no specific regulations for individual tracking data itself in Canada, but the collection, use, and the disclosure of geolocation data is regulated by existing privacy laws and regulations. For example, in Canada, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, it's called PIPEDA, is a federal privacy law that regulates how private sectors or organizations collect, use, and disclosure personal information, including location information. And moreover, the Canada's privacy commissioners has also issued several guidelines and recommendations on the use of geolocation data. For example, let's say the commissioner recommends the organizations obtain users' express consent before collecting their location data, and that they have to implement reasonable security measures to protect the data. But again, these are very brief and general guidelines. There isn't any like detailed and specific regulations for those like individual tracking or mobility data itself.
Well, actually, that leads right into one of my other questions. So what, as researchers, like what policies and regulations would you like to see? Let's go a little bit more on the transparency side, right? That would help you to be able to do the work that you need to do to help build those better solutions for cities and transport. None.
Maybe,
No.
Yeah, maybe I
Gio,
can
go ahead.
just bring 1 or 2 points on this. I think one of the major concerns once scholars or organizations decided to whether to share their data is the potential risk of violating privacy laws or something, because they actually, we don't exactly know like how much risk the data we collect that there is if we share it with publics, right? So I think what I'm expecting, or I mean, it's difficult, but I think what expecting in order to promote the sharing data is to list some very clear and specific standards let's say, what type of data, including what kind of privacy informations that you needed to achieve a certain level of privacy that measured by a kind of standards, as I mentioned, either the privacy as a differential privacy or the key anonymities. And if your data being masked or meet that kind of standards, that you are allowed to share it with some users, with specific user. But I would say it's difficult to share the individual level tracking data with the public. But as you meet some standards or regulation or requirements, then you can feel comfortable to share it with other scholars or researchers for research purpose. And with that, as a researcher, let's say if I have the certain, like I do have like individual tracking data, and then I would say I will comfortable because after this and this, after the geomasking of the data and it meets a certain standards, I can share it with another scholar from a different university or even different country.
Could I
We
jump
have
in?
another, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. No, so for me, I think one more important thing also is that all the agencies have to develop some kind of in-house capacity to do this stuff. You cannot when we are talking about geomasking or anything, you cannot rely on a third party. I mean, that's what happened with the Sidewalk project in Toronto, right? Like a lot of data went to third party, and the government did not know what is happening with that data. So all these things have to be developed in-house, and there have to be policies which guide these kind of practices, so that there is a standard manual, standard practice which can be followed by people instead of just giving it to third parties and relying on them and accepting that whatever they are telling you.
So I think that point about third parties leads right into another question that we just got into the chat, which is, what are some of the ways or processes to access mobile data from private sector companies? What, sort of what incentives would they have to share data for academic research purposes, or requirements that we might place if they're collecting public data into their private agency to sort of share for public good?
Well, some service providers, such as TELUS, have programs to provide access to their data. This is I'm talking about the Data for Good program, which TELUS, and you can apply to get access to their data and so forth. Now, on their side, they have to be concerned about addressing the issues you were talking about, Joy, in terms of anonymizing it, ensuring that it can't be worked backwards, if you will. And so when you work with the data, what you find it's highly restricted, and essentially the mobility aspects are removed. Okay, so the question is, from the data that is provided, can some useful work be done? I believe that it can, but it depends on the researcher's specific goal. So it's, I guess in a certain sense, it's a lot safer for a service provider to just not give access to the data, right? But in this case, TELUS chose to give some access, but they put a lot of care into making sure it's a private, it maintains the privacy of the individuals. Okay, it's aggregated to a large degree. So it's difficult to work backwards to individuals. I'm not sure that there's rock solid technical mathematical standards that say you have this level of privacy, okay? Because let's say humans are very creative at breaking things. Okay.
Yeah, so
But
that
anyway,
kind
that's one example. That's one example of providing data.
that brings me to I think what'll be our final question, but I'd love to hear from all of you. That as the social scientist who deals with humans all the time and deals with things like informed consent, which we're not getting here, right, from mobility data, I noted that Jue said we should raise awareness. And I thought, gosh, most people really struggle to understand, what's happening in data for networks where they know that they're giving their data away, much less, we're driving around and our data sort of being collected on us. So if we want to raise awareness and we still want to have access to data to solve, social problems and mobility issues, what do we want people to be aware of?
That's a good question.
Great.
I think generally speaking, say for now, while we're using a different kind of app or applications on our mobile phones, a lot of time there is like while in registering for the services or register account with apps, you need to check. I read all the agreement, privacy agreement, something, but I would say 99.9% of people won't read it.
Nope.
Right? Even me, I won't read it 99%. So I would just check it and sign up. So here's a big issue because people actually don't know what kind of information or data they agreed to contribute. Even though it seems like they consent to contribute data, but actually they have no idea what kind of data they're being contributed. They're being allowed to be collected, and what will be the purpose of the use of the data, right? So of course, I understand that if we're busy and if we like people to know about those things, and maybe a lot of people will say, oh, I won't agree to contribute any kind of data. Just to make things simple, no, nothing can be collected from me. And then that'll be another issue because we may not be able to collect data for the benefit, for the good of the society as a whole. But it doesn't mean that we can sacrifice the people's awareness about their personal informations. So it's hard to say what kind of campaigns, but this is a general idea. We needed to raise awareness for the people that no matter what kind of application or services sign up for, they need to know that whether their geolocation or they'll be tracked. It's very easy to be tracked, if you using mobile phones. So they needed to, if they're willing to contribute, they need to know that, and it's their personal will to contribute data and to share the data.
I think, go ahead, Gaurav,
Okay.
just real quickly.
Just I'll be very brief. I will pick up from Jue. And I would say that if we want to bring awareness in data policies and all that, we have to start thinking of data not as a legal issue, but as a social issue. We have to simplify the language. We have to tell people what is happening instead of sending them in the labyrinth of all these terms and conditions, which nobody's going to read. And as you said, then they would not want to share any data. So we have to simplify that. We have to make it more social, more accessible.
Yeah, actually, one more thing to add on. Whether I have
Real
time.
quick, it's Judy.
One sentence.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. One sentence. So actually, in the
No.
EU, in the European Union, their regulations, their data protection regulation do have one sentence that if you want to collect a user's consent of their data, you have to provide clear and understandable information about the purpose and scope of the data collection. I think this should be added into Canadian regulations as well.
Yeah, let me build on that.
Great.
You know how annoying it is when you're paying and do you want to donate this for that and this for that? Now, I think that there need to be clear regulations in terms of how you give permissions and what it means. And it can't be built into deep in the legalese of the agreement. It's got to be public industry standard. And so then, and the default is that the data belongs to the user. And so you have explicit permission. Are you willing to share your data for this? And there can be, you have your 5, 10, 15% tip. Well, for these reasons, and you go and push that, and then that's it. But the prerequisite for that is clear, uniform, standard understanding of what those permissions mean.
Well, I'd really love to thank our panelists. Obviously, we could spend a lot more time on this, but this is a series of talks. So I'm going to turn it back over to Judy to tell us about the next few that are coming up.
And I'll be back. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I have only thanks to our panelists. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you, Bree, for moderating. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we hope we'll see you again. This is the third in a series of 6 sessions of The Way Forward, and we'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about moving and housing multitudes in the Toronto region. Let's talk affordable housing. Registration is open for all 3 remaining sessions. You'll find these advertised on our website. You'll get reminders if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and you can subscribe on our website. And you can always find out more by contacting us. Thank you very much. This session has been recorded and will be shared, and you can find that on our website. Thanks again for joining us. Hope we see you again in 2 weeks. Bye for now.